Hello, welcome to Triggered Care. I'm Alex. Today I'm doing a requested video from a lovely Discord user and a friend of mine. Quite honestly, we've talked for a while. I really enjoy her company a lot. She's got a lot of good ideas, and this video topic was one of hers. So today I'm talking about diagnosis and getting diagnosed for me personally. And I actually already recorded this video, but then I remembered while editing it, oh yeah, I was sort of diagnosed 10 years before that. And so I'm re-recording it to add in that little bit of diagnosis. And there's a cat like crawling all over me, so forgive me for random noises. So, getting diagnosed. My first experience with it was when I was 12 years old. And when I was 12 years old, it was peculiar because, I turned 12, and then my mother had this talk with me, you have to go see a counselor to make sure you're not weird and that you're normal. And I didn't really know what that meant, I was so used to her insulting me. It's okay, so now I gotta go prove that I'm not a crazy person to make my ma feel better. And so she took me into the counselor, and the counselor talked to me for a little bit. Not that I can remember much of that conversation at all. But then I took an assessment, this test thing, so then I could get diagnosed, or so they could see what my issues are. I can't remember what test it was or any of the criteria. And this is partly why I forgot about most of it, is because I didn't even think about this. But my memories from back then are really fuzzy. So anyway, I take this assessment, and the results come back with I am depressed with obsessive compulsive behaviors that lean towards perfectionism issues. And then I continue to see this counselor, therapist lady every 2 weeks for a while through middle school. We didn't really talk about me at all because I didn't want to talk about me because I was terrified of being labeled as crazy and, not good by this therapist lady. So we mostly talked about her family because she could tell that I didn't want to talk about anything. I think it was probably her way of trying to get me to open up, but I just active listened very well and asked more questions about her own family versus trying to talk about mine or what's going on in my life. So when I was first sort of diagnosed at 12, it was with depression and OCD behaviors that would indicate perfectionism. Then go forward 10 years. Okay, I've gone to a few therapists in the meantime of that 10 years, sometimes state ordered, sometimes out of my own volition, but they never lasted that long. I think the longest one that lasted before I got to my therapist now was 6 months of me going to a therapist and then, giving up. And nobody ever mentioned trauma to me. Nobody ever mentioned any of that sort of thing. They would just, I've been called resilient before that, but I never thought about trauma and that being associated with me at all. So 10 years go by, I'm getting really severely depressed. My psychotic episodes are really bad, and I need help. So I make an appointment with a therapist down the road because I can tell that I'm becoming more unstable, and I want to get better purely for my husband at this point. This is before we were having our baby boy, before all of that, and I was living with him, and I felt horrible that he was stuck with me. So I decided, okay, I'm going to go to the therapist down the road because I need help. So I started seeing that therapist, and it wasn't until the third appointment with her, something like that. I had gone to a couple appointments with her, and once I got comfortable enough with it, I told her about my hallucinations. and mostly my visual hallucinations, seeing people who aren't there, and I know that they're not there because they're passed away, or seeing cats in my car when there aren't really cats there. And when I first told her about it, her reaction was a little bit nerve-wracking, not purposely on her part, just I think it's surprising for therapists when they're used to depression and anxiety issues to have a patient come in and the last 5 minutes of the session go, oh, by the way, sometimes I see stuff that's not there. So have a good day. I wanted to slip it in and then run away. And then she's like, okay, Alex, how about we start talking about this immediately for our next session? Because this is something that should be brought up in the beginning of a session. And I have a psychiatrist friend who is sort of retired, but he takes individual cases sometimes still. I'm going to talk to him. We're going to get you an appointment set up. I think you could also be hallucinating voices in your head from what you've told me about the monologues that go on in your head. And that blew my mind when she told me that, because I'm like, what? You're saying these monologues in my head that I argue with isn't just me being a crazy person, I never considered those hallucinations per se. I considered them different monologues. So she sent me home and is like, all right, I'm going to set up an appointment in the next few days, next week or something. I'll let you know. Just try to relax. We don't know anything yet. It could be a number of different things. So I'm like, okay. So I went home that day very anxious and wondering what I have. And she told me not to settle on any diagnosis because, of course, I'm not going to know until I talk to someone who can diagnose that. So I'm trying to not be like, oh, I'm schizophrenic. But that's what was happening in my brain is like, you have schizophrenia and you've never known it. And oh my God. And so I was trying to handle that, not get too overwhelmed with it. And then the voices were going off in my brain discussing it too. And it was just a big anxiety-filled wait for me until the appointment finally came up. An appointment day comes and I sit down with my therapist. I had asked her to sit in with me because I was really nervous about meeting a psychiatrist and getting diagnosed. It was somewhat nerve-wracking for me. And of course she agreed. She's like, yeah, I can sit in the room with you. He's a friend of mine. And that's more than okay if you want another support person there. So she's sitting in. And then he comes into the room, the psychiatrist. And he says in a big, booming voice, hello, my name is so-and-so. What are you doing here today? And as soon as he looked at me and talked with me with that volume and that tone of voice, I disassociated hard because my brain is like, danger. This person is very intimidating. And what happened next was he called me out. Well, not called me out in a bad way, but he called me out. He goes, hey, therapist lady, did you see that? She just disassociated. And I hadn't really heard this word before, especially not in context to myself. So I was kind of surprised and almost like, how does he know that there's a change going on in my head? Because at that point, I could tell when there was a different mode set in my head, but I didn't know the names for it. I didn't know the terms for it. And so it was like really fascinating to me that he was calling out something that I thought only I knew about because that's just my weirdness. I didn't realize that it was criteria for a disorder of any sort. So he calls me out on it, and then after that, he continues asking me questions about my life, and it's dawning on me how terrible my memory is, because I thought I had remembered my life pretty well. But then, he starts asking more about the specifics, and it's like, I don't know. I don't know how to help you. And then when he asked about abuse things, I was a lot more defensive than I thought I would be. Like, no, I wasn't traumatized. Just things happen. Just life is hard sometimes. I'm trying to like explain away like my parents are good parents. They're just really strict. And then he asked me about sexual abuse. And that's when I got real antsy. And I'm like, well, my parents never sexually abused me, so I'm fine. Like, I was so defensive about so many things without even realizing it. Because I was in like this weird protective shell of brainwashing almost, where it's like, you can't talk about this stuff that openly. We're not going to let you access it. And it was really hard for me to get through it, but I tried to tell him everything I could remember. The miscarriages, being raped, that sort of thing. But I didn't want to talk about it too long. Like, well, yeah, that happened to me, but my life is good other than that. And so he's listening to me, and after an hour and a half of what seems like the longest conversation in my life, where I'm trying to remember things and I can't, and I'm kind of confused, but I'm super intrigued on what he has to say about it. And after all the questions, he pulls my therapist to the side for a bit to talk to her one-on-one, and then he comes back to sit down with me, and he explains that I have PTSD with something called psychoaffective disorder, which means I have psychotic episodes due to trauma, and it's rare, but it can happen, especially if the trauma is severe and prolonged. And I was shocked. I was surprised. I was not expecting a PTSD diagnosis, to be honest with you. I was expecting a schizophrenic diagnosis, because that would explain all the psychotic episodes, but also not put the blame on my parents, because that wasn't even a possibility for me at that point of life, because I was still deep in the self-blame. Everything's my fault. Nothing bad really happened to me. I'm just a dramatic baby. That sort of negative self-talk was still really strong and a foundational part of my thinking at the time. So hearing from a professional, and not only that, he was like, obviously you have PTSD. And it's like, how do you know that? What is so obvious about me that is like, oh, look at this PTSD poster child who exhibits all of the things having to do with PTSD. And so, yeah, and it took me a while. It took me a while to understand the diagnosis. It took me a while to actually allow it to be applicated to my life, because of the self-doubt. Even after being diagnosed, it still took my brain a while to absorb that information and be like, hey, Alex, you're a trauma survivor. That's why you have these psychotic episodes. That's why you hear voices. That's why you see things that aren't there. It's not something inherently wrong with me. Like, I wasn't born just like an alien that has weird reactions to things, whereas everybody else is normal. It's very much, there's a lot of other people like me who have gone through a lot of trauma, and as a result, they have psychotic episodes. As a result, they have extreme PTSD episodes, along with the depression and the anxiety and all of that can be bunched up in it. Trauma causes a lot of disorders, especially when it goes on untreated and ignored for a long time. So that was my diagnosis experience. And every psych I've seen since then, usually they confirm the PTSD diagnosis. The last psych that I had diagnosed me was just, when you have a new psychiatrist, sometimes they'll overview, your medical records and all of that, and then they'll be like, well, looks like you have this, and you're like, I know, I've been diagnosed for a long time. But the last psych who did that, she told me about, have you heard of CPTSD? And I'm like, yes, I have. I've been entrenched in recovery now for like 5 years. I've done some research, and best psych. My psych now is the best psych that I've had. So, hoofda, that was a bit of rambling. So, if you have any psychiatrist stories you want to share, or any stories that you want to share, my email's down below, along with those Discord links for you to join the community, talk about stuff, and, PTSD tracker stuff. I haven't mentioned that in a while, but we're still doing that, checking in every weekend pretty much with our mood numbers. And yeah. Oh, and also Facebook link down below. I hope y'all have a good one.